Hey guys, it's Geoff here. I just got back in from a 7-hour long drive. So if I look a little disheveled, that's partly why. Um, but while I was driving, my mind had plenty of time to wander, and at some point it drifted off to some of my blogging, things I'm talking about, stuff I'm studying in school. And I realized, I'm overdue for part two of that flexibility talk that I began a couple weeks back. I didn't forget about it. I've just been swamped with school. But part one focused on the structural side of flexibility. Basically, how the shape of the structures in your body, the ligaments and especially the bony structures, will create and at the same time limit the movement opportunities that you have. And that structural understanding is, I think, very, very important as a foundation for understanding how we actually do move. But it's incomplete. We need an understanding of the muscular system. Because muscles at the end of the day are what actually provide the internal force we generate to control these bones in space. Their job is really to manage joints, to manage the contact between bones, whether that's creating motion or preventing motion by stabilizing, by resisting an external force or something, or orchestrating motion or coordinating or controlling it in a very specific way by modulating the amount of force that a whole bunch of different muscles can impart to a bone. I'm not going to get too specific on that right now. But that idea that the neuromuscular system really plays into motion and flexibility as a result, that idea is central to what part two is going to be. Part one talked about stability and opportunity or mobility being provided by the structure. Once again, the skeletal system, the bones, as well as connective tissues, particularly ligaments and tendons to some extent. But muscles are what actively do that stuff, the moving or the preventing of movement in a lot of cases. For instance, right now I'm sitting up in my chair and there are a ton of muscles working to keep me from falling over. Throughout the typical day, we have a lot more muscles involved in restricting motion and keeping you in a specific position or preventing excess motion at whatever joint you want to look at than creating it. We have a bias towards looking at the thing that moves, but really it's the stuff that's not moving that's allowing that thing to move in the way that it does. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that as sort of a preview leading into my segment I'm going to do on the neuromuscular system. It's really involved, and the amount of information I'm going to give when I do the blog entry is actually only going to be scratching the surface. It really is a very deep subject. But I wanted to talk just a minute about it. It was on my mind when I was driving, and so I wanted to just drop a couple little ideas there. The first one being just that the muscular system is obviously a key role. Now, I think everybody knew that, but there are a couple important points I think to take into account when it comes to understanding how we become flexible. First thing is, muscles are not rubber bands. They don't actually stretch. So when you're holding a stretch, if I put my leg out, and do something like this, and like a hamstring stretch, quote unquote, even though it can really be stretching a whole bunch of other things, and maybe not the hamstrings. That's a talk for another day. But if I'm reaching and doing this stretch-like thing that I've been taught to do, well, what's really happening? Muscles are active tissues. I'll talk about this mechanism in more detail in the future, but you can think of muscles almost as like active Velcro. I think that's not a bad analogy, because really within an individual muscle cell, sometimes called a muscle fiber, there are these little myofibrils, and I'll talk about all the vocabulary at another time, where you can see it on the page and it'll be more organized and hopefully make more sense. But basically, these little guys have small proteins in them, these little contractile components that attach to one another. They kind of ratchet together. And if you ever look really, really closely at, a strip of Velcro, the opposing sides that actually stick together, you see that one side has a whole bunch of hooks, the other has a whole bunch of loops, and they kind of lock together. Well, when it comes to muscles, they're kind of like that, sort of. And there's an active process that requires energy for them to open up and relax, and then to grab on. And then while some are still grabbed on, others relax and grab on and pull more. And this is happening, you know, tons of times, thousands or millions of times throughout a muscle, you know, in a given second or even in a split second. This stuff is happening really, really fast and really, 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 really frequently in a lot of different places. But when you stretch a muscle, what you're really trying to do, if you're trying to get more flexibility in the moment, if you do what's called a static stretch, like I said, where I stick my leg out and do that reach, well, if I hold it for 20 or 30 seconds or a minute and it relaxes and I can suddenly go farther into that range, it's not because the muscle actually got longer. Its resting length didn't change. I didn't structurally change anything there. What I did was tell the muscle, hey, dude, relax. And so some of those little attachments released so the muscle could slide a little bit, so it could open up and get a little bit longer. Some of those guys just relaxed and let go. So that's a neurological thing. We can send a signal to a muscle to tell it to relax. So when you're trying to stretch, that relaxation you feel is actually a neurological response to the stress you put on it. Once again, there's a mechanism behind this, or a few mechanisms responsible for this that I don't want to get into right now. This is just a quick talk. But you have to understand that before you can understand stretching and what that really is. So I wanted to get that point across. Muscles are not rubber bands. They're more involved than that. They're more intricate than that. There's a lot more going on under the surface than what it looks like. So we'll explore that later. And another thing to think about is in terms of just generating the ability to go into a place. I want to build this idea in your head of stability. What I mean by that is, it's been my experience, and I'll talk about this more in the future, that the body will give you mobility, will give you the opportunity to go into a range if you have stability there and if you have strength there. So basically, if all the muscles involved in getting my arm up here are strong and are responding properly on a neurological level, like my nervous system, my brain, and my spinal cord, and the associated nerves can actually communicate with all those muscles and tell them what to do, and they listen properly, and then they communicate back properly, if all that wiring is working right, then we have a much better chance of having control over all the movements I'm trying to do. And thus my body will allow me to go into that range, to go to that position. If there's weakness or if there's instability, and I'll talk more about instability in the future, then really you're going to have a little bit more difficulty there through some mechanisms of inhibition, and I'm not going to get into all the technical stuff, but just plant the seed in your head right now. We'll talk about it more later. When you have stability, you have mobility. I don't like to use things that rhyme or that sound cute, but in this particular case, it kind of works. And then if you don't have stability, if you don't have strength and control into a range, the body tends to restrict that. It's not always the case, but it tends to do that. And we'll explore why. So if you're trying to get flexible, if you're trying to, whether it's kick higher, like, and I talked about this actually in a video I did not too long ago on doing roundhouse kicks for a friend of mine. But if you're trying to kick higher, or if you're trying to reach farther, or whatever it is that involves some component of flexibility, work on actually getting strong going there. So think about the stuff that pulls you there. If I can't quite twist very far this way, I don't want to necessarily grab my leg and crank my body more. Maybe I just want to use those muscles that pull me in that direction actively. I'll talk more in the future about active versus passive stretching and what the benefits might be of doing more stuff actively. But the general idea of just get stronger in the direction you want to go in and see what that does for you. Build some stability and see if you don't have more mobility. So that's the other idea. I'm going to talk about my ideas behind visiting the positions, a phrase I like to use. I'll explain that later. And a bunch of other concepts in a future video, in future blogs, all of that stuff. But I just wanted to give a few thoughts here. You know, we're about 10 minutes here, so I'm going to cut it off. But I wanted to talk about just this idea of, you know, one, that muscles aren't really like rubber bands. There's a lot more going on there that I'm going to explain in the future. And two, that if you're stable and if you're strong, you tend to actually have more mobility than you would otherwise have. So it's counterintuitive to some people. It's actually, you think about these muscle-bound guys that are really strong, and you know, if you have too much strength, you're too tight. It's not necessarily the case. So we'll talk about that more in the future. I want to leave you with a few of those thoughts, and feel free to comment, send me a message. Just let me know what you think, and there's going to be more to come. So part 2 of my flexibility blog entry on specifically the neuromuscular system, so how we control movement through our muscles and how those guys work for flexibility purposes, will hopefully come in the very near future. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and hopefully you got a little something out of this, but I just wanted to share that. So till next time.